Hi everyone. Today we are talking about something called inverse operations. And it sounds complicated, but inverse operations are the same operations you already know and love: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. But inverse means opposite. So we can kind of think of operations in pairs. So for example, let's start with add. The inverse or opposite operation of add is going to be subtract. So add and subtract are inverse operations. So now let's go on to multiply. I want you to take a second and think about what is the opposite of multiply. What is the opposite of multiply? If you said divide, you are correct. So the opposite of add is subtract. The opposite of subtract is add. So those are two inverse operations. The same with multiply and divide. The opposite of multiply is divide. The opposite of divide is to multiply. So those are two inverse operations. Another way to think about inverse operations are that inverse operations are operations that undo each other. So if you add something and then take it away, that undoes it. If you subtract something and then add it, it undoes it. It's like nothing ever happened. And also if you multiply and then divide, same thing, those undo each other. So inverse operations are opposite operations that undo each other. So we need to be able to quickly identify what inverse operations are when we are given an operation. So when I see, okay, it says the inverse operation of add is, so I need to think, what is the opposite of add? The opposite of add is subtract. Okay. Now the inverse operation of subtract. The inverse operation of subtract. So I want you to think to yourself, what is the opposite of taking away? What's the opposite of subtracting? If you said add, you are correct. Notice how the opposite of add is subtract, the opposite of subtract is add. They're a pair, they kind of go together. Okay? Now again, the inverse operation of multiply. If I see something is multiplied, I know that the inverse of that is to divide. And then our last one here, the inverse operation of divide is to multiply. So we're going to be talking a lot in lessons about the opposite operation or the inverse operation. So when I say what's the opposite of add, you need to know it's subtract. When I say what is the opposite or inverse of divide, you need to know that it's multiply. Okay, so they kind of go together in pairs. Add and subtract are together. Add and subtract are opposites of each other. Multiply and divide are opposites of each other. Those are the operations that undo the other one. So what this might look like if you have numbers involved is if we have this, we can see, okay, what is the inverse of -1? What is the inverse of -1? So this is a subtraction. This right here tells me that we're subtracting 1. But I want the inverse of that. So the opposite of subtracting 1 is adding 1. Right? Now, the opposite of adding 1 is subtracting 1. So again, those are pairs. Okay? So moving on down to the next one. What is the inverse of multiplying by 9? And remember, that is multiplying. I have to use the X symbol there, although sometimes it can get confusing with the variable. But that is multiplying. So the opposite of multiplying, think to yourself, what's the opposite of multiply? The opposite of multiply is divide. So the opposite of multiply by 9 is divide by 9. Now, there's something important to know, that we're in algebra, and a lot of times we are not going to use this symbol for divide. Sometimes the way that you're going to see division is like this. In fact, I'm going to use it like this probably for most of the lessons. Divide by 9. Those two things say the same thing. They both say divide by 9. Okay? So the inverse of times 9 is divide by 9. Okay. 2 more. What is the inverse of dividing by 4? And remember that this symbol right here, that symbol, it really means divide. Right? So what is the inverse? What is the opposite of divide by 4? Well, it's going to be multiply by 4. Okay? Our last one here. What is the inverse? And remember, inverse means opposite of plus 7. I want you to think to yourself, what is the opposite of plus 7? That is addition. So what is the opposite of addition? What is the opposite of addition? The opposite of addition is subtraction. So the inverse of plus 7 is minus 7. Okay, so your assignment today is going to ask you these questions. You're looking for the opposite operation for each question. And so if it's asking you what's the inverse of add, you say subtract. If it's asking you for the inverse of plus 2, you say minus 2. So just be thinking opposite operations, opposite operations, opposite operations. Okay? The other thing to pay really close attention to is you do have to be careful of the symbols. Remember that if you see something that says times, let's say 5, that the inverse of that, you might see the inverse of that written as divide by, inverse is, you can write it as divide by 5, but how I write it in these problems is like this, with a slash to show divide. Okay, so be careful. Know that the slash means divide. We've kind of talked about that before, but just to refresh your memory. So now you're going to go forward and you're going to go actually and click on the assignment link in Google Classroom. Make sure you come back to this video if you need to, and you can email me. Of course, remember you can email me at showard@sheltonschools.org. All right. Let me know if you have any questions.